In the last video, we created a little chat page. We can type in a name like Andrew and a room like Node Course, and we can go ahead and join that room. Now, when we do, we're brought to the chat page, but nothing is actually happening behind the scenes to use any of these values. They're showing up in the URL, but that's about it. The goal in this video is to take these values and pass them from the client to the server so the server can keep track of who's in which room, and we can set up that private communication. Currently, if user 1 is in Node Course and user 2 is in React Course, both of them are going to be able to talk to each other because this data is not used. Now, the first step in getting this data to the server is figuring out where it lives. This actually lives in the location object. We're going to use the console to just play around with it. Location is a global object that's provided by your browser, and on it we have a whole bunch of really interesting things. Things like host, host name, href origin path name. What we're going to be using is search. As you can see here, search is the query string, everything from the question mark to the end of the word course, what I have highlighted here. The goal is to get this into a more useful format. Right now we have just this string and we're going to need to parse this. We're actually going to use a library to do that now that we know where it lives. We can access window.location.search to get this value. Now I'm adding window up front just to make sure we're accessing the global location property as opposed to a local variable which may or may not exist called location. This is going to be the most foolproof way to fetch the query string. Now, the next thing we're going to do is talk about params and deparams. Inside of jQuery, we actually have access to a function. We can access it by calling jQuery.param, and we can pass in an object. Let's go ahead and create a little object right here. We'll set name equal to your first name. I'm going to set it equal to Andrew, and we'll set age equal to something like 25. Now, when I run this statement, jQuery is going to take that object and convert it into a set of parameters that could be added onto a URL. Here, you can see we have name equals Andrew and age equals 25. This is similar to the format we have up above, minus the question mark. All we'd have to do is add one onto the beginning, and we would have a complete search string. Now, the problem with jQuery is that it cannot do it in the other direction, meaning it cannot take this string and convert it back into an object, which is kind of what we want. We want to be able to access this data easily. Currently, that is just not possible. There's also quirks like encoding and plus characters. This was originally a space, but it got converted to a plus by the form. We're going to want to decode all of that too. Luckily, there is a simple library we can include, and we can grab it by going to links.mead.io/dparam. Param takes your object and returns the string. Dparam takes the string and returns an object. And here we have a simple gist. It's a really short function that we're going to be adding to our project. Let's go to the raw version of this page. Then we're going to save it using right-click Save As, and we're going to add it right into our project. We have our public JS libs folder, and right in here, we'll simply save it as dparam.js. Now, once we have that file saved, we can actually include it. This is going to make it much easier to work with the search data. Down below, inside of Atom, I'm going to head over to chat.html. We're not going to need this in index.html, but inside of chat.html, we are going to load it in down below. We'll make a new script tag. And we're going to go ahead and set the source equal to, inside of quotes, /js/libs/d-param.js. Now, when we save chat.html and head back into the browser, we can actually refresh the page and play around with this in the console before ever adding it to our code. We now have access to jQuery.dparam. If I run this statement, we're going to get our function back, confirming that it does exist. And all we need to do is pass in the string. This is the search string. Window.location.search. So we're taking that search string, we're passing it into dparam, and the resulting object is exactly what we want. We have a name property equal to Andrew, and we have a room property equal to node space course. All those special characters like the and symbol, the question mark, and the plus character, they've all been removed and replaced with this nicely formatted object. This is what we're going to use inside of our client-side code to get the values and pass them to the server, which is what we're going to do right now. Inside of Atom, this is all going to happen in chat.js. Right here, we have our connect callback function. This happens when we first connect, and right away when we connect, we're going to emit an event that's going to start the process of joining a room. Now, Socket.io has built-in support for the idea of rooms, creating these little isolated areas where only certain people can emit and listen to events. All of that gets set up on the server though, which means right in here, when we connect to the server, all we're going to do is emit an event called join. This is going to start the process. First up, let's go ahead and grab our parameters, the ones that we just learned how to deparam over inside of the console. Var params equals jQuery.deparam, and we're going to pass in window.location.search just like we did before. Now we have our object, and we can go ahead and emit an event. Right here, we're going to call socket.emit, and the event that we're going to emit, it's going to be a custom event we'll be creating, is going to be called join. This is going to get emitted from the client, and it's going to get listened to by the server. When the server hears this join event, it's going to go through the process of setting up the room. Now, not all of that's going to happen in this video, but we can get started. The data that we're going to send across is just going to be the params object. It may or may not include everything we need. We'll be doing a little validation on the server. And last but not least, we are going to set up acknowledgements for this one. If someone does join the room, we want to know that. If someone doesn't, we want to know that too, because if they don't join the room, it's most likely because they provided invalid data, which means that we want to kick them back to that join form, forcing them to provide both a name and a room name. Right here, we can go ahead and set up our function. And this function could take an argument. We're going to be setting it up ourselves so we can decide if it takes an argument. And it definitely does make sense for it to take one. In this case, we're going to go ahead and provide any errors. If there is an error, that's fine. We'll be able to handle it. If there is no error, that's great too. We'll go ahead and do something else. Right in here, we can do something if an error exists using if error. And we can go ahead and add an else clause too. If there is no error, we want to do a different thing. Now, we're not going to fill this out at the moment. What we're going to do at this point in time is go ahead and actually set up the listener inside of server.js for join. That is going to happen over in server.js. We can make that the very first event just above create message. Right here, socket.on join. Now, as we already know, we are going to be taking some arguments in the callback function. We're going to get our parameters. We can call these params, and we're also going to get that callback function since we are setting up acknowledgements. Inside of the join function, the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually validate the data that came through, both the name and the room. These are both potential properties on params. All we really care is that they are non-empty strings, meaning that it's not just a space, it's not just an empty string, and it's not a non-string type, like a number or an object. Something like this might have a length, but it's not exactly going to be a valid username or a valid room name. In order to set up this validation, which we're going to be doing in other places too, like create message, we're going to create a separate utils file. In here, I'm going to call this validation.js, and this is where we can put some validators that we're going to need throughout the project. In this video, we're going to create one called isRealString. This is going to verify that a value is of a type string and that it's not just a bunch of spaces. It actually has real characters inside of it. We're going to set this equal to a function that takes a string. This is going to be the string we validate, and it's actually not going to be terribly difficult. We're going to return, and we're going to return the following conditions. It'll return true if it is a real string and false if it's not. First up, we'll use type of. This is going to get the type of the string variable. This needs to equal, in quotes, string. Now currently, this is going to return true for any string and false for any non-string value. But it does not take into account the spaces. What we're going to do is use the trim method available on strings, which takes a string like this and converts it into a string like this, trimming all white space. If you pass in a string like this, it's going to convert it into a string like this, trimming leading and trailing white space only. It's not going to trim any interior spacing, so if I have F space R, down below I am still going to get that space between F and R, but all of the leading and trailing spaces are removed. We're going to use that right here, and str.trim has a length greater than 0. After we call trim, we do need a length greater than 0. Otherwise, we have an empty string. This is going to be our isRealString function, and we're going to go ahead and export it real quickly. Module.exports, setting it equal to an object where we set isRealString equal to the isRealString function as defined above. Awesome. Now I can go ahead and save this file. I'm also going to go ahead and inside of server.js call this function. We need to import it first before we can actually validate those two properties. Just up above, we're going to do that. Right here, we can make a const and use ES6 destructuring to grab isRealString, and we're going to grab it using require. We're requiring a local file, // it's in that utils directory, and the file name is validation, just like this. Now we can call isRealString. Inside of join, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to check if either of them are not real strings. If one or more are not real strings, we're going to call the callback passing in the error. Right here, if params.name is the first one, we're going to pass that into isRealString. Params.name. Now we want to check if it's not a real string, so we're going to flip that. Or, and here we're going to check if the other property, the room name, is not a real string. Now inside of the query string, that is called room. Back inside of Atom, if it's not, is real string, passing in the correct value, params.room, then that's going to be an error too. And right here, we can handle that error. All I'm going to do is call the callback with a little string message. Name and room name are required. Perfect. Now, if that's not the case, we do still want to call the callback, but we don't want to pass any arguments in, because remember, that first argument, we set that up to be the error argument, and if both things are valid, we do not want to pass any errors back. Over inside of server.js, we now have some pretty basic validation set up. And before we actually do anything in here, which is going to be in the upcoming videos, all we're going to do is add a few cases right here. If it is an error, that's a pretty big problem. And we're going to want to send the user back to the root of the application by changing one of the properties under location, window.location.href. Here we can manipulate which page the user's on. Essentially, we're going to be redirecting them back to that root page by having the / value set to the href property. Now, before we do that, we can do whatever we like. Maybe we want to display a modal using our framework of choice, whether it's Foundation, Bootstrap, or anything else. To keep things simple here, all we're going to do is call alert, passing in the error just like this. So a user will see a little alert box. They'll then click OK, and they'll be redirected back to the home page. Now, if there is no error, all we're going to do for the moment is use console.log to print no error. Awesome. With this in place, let's go ahead and test that things are working as expected over inside of the browser. I'm going to give my current page a refresh. Now here we do have a valid name and a valid room. So when I click refresh, we should see no error printing in the console, and that's exactly what we get. The data we passed through was indeed valid. Now we can go ahead and go to the root of the page and try some invalid data. To demonstrate this, all I'm going to do is click join without providing either value. This is going to bring us to the chat app, and you can see we get our little alert box. Name and room name are required. We click OK, which is all we can do, and we're immediately redirected back to join a chat. If I do provide some valid data, like a display name of Mike and a room name of developers, we are going to be brought to the chat page, and we'll see no error shows up, which is fantastic. Now, one last test real quick. If we have just spaces, I'm going to change the room name to a bunch of spaces, and we click join, we are going to still get the error, even though we do have a bunch of plus signs for spaces up above. Those are going to be swapped out for spaces when we run our code through dparam, and the error is still going to occur. Now that we have this in place, we are in a pretty good spot to actually integrate rooms in the next video. Before we do though, your challenge for this one is going to be to write some test cases for the brand new validation function we just created, which means we're going to make a new test file called validation.test.js, and inside of here, we're going to load in expect, making a variable called expect. We could also make it a constant. We're going to set that equal to require, and we're going to require the expect library just like we always do. Next up, we're going to load in real string, which is going to be part of the challenge. Import is real string, and we're going to add 3 test cases down below. The describe block should be something like is real string, and the 3 test cases will be as follows. Should reject non-string values. In this case, I want you to pass a number, object, or anything else into the isRealString function. You should get false back. Next up, should reject strings with only spaces. If I have a string that's just a bunch of spaces, that should not pass the isRealString function validation. That's also going to fail. Trim is going to remove all of those spaces, and the length will be 0. Last up, should allow strings with non-space characters. In this case, you can pass in whatever you like, some sort of valid value. You could have space, LOTR for Lord of the Rings. The beginning spaces are going to get trimmed out, so it's not important. You could have the letter A. Any valid string is going to pass this one. Go ahead and set up those 3 test cases, making sure the right Boolean value comes back from isRealString. When you're done, run npm test from the terminal. Make sure all of your 3 tests passed, and then you can go ahead and click play. How'd you do? Hopefully you were able to test this function without too much trouble. The first thing we're going to do is import it by making a variable. We can make this a constant or a variable. I'm going to go with a constant. And we're going to use ES6 destructuring to grab isRealString, and we're going to grab it off of the require call to our local file, /validation, which is just alongside the current file validation.test.js. Now we can add the things we have down below, starting with our describe block. We're going to describe the isRealString function. Then we can add our arrow function, and inside of here we can go ahead and provide our individual test cases. And I'm going to copy it directly. Should reject non-string values. This is going to be a synchronous test, so there's no reason to add the done argument. Inside of here, we're going to pass in a non-string value. I'm going to make a variable called response, which will store the return result from isRealString. We're going to call it, passing in some sort of non-string value. Anything would work. I'm going to use a number 98. Now down below, we can use expect to assert that the response variable equals false, which should be the case. We're expecting response to be false. Perfect. Next up, it should reject string with only spaces. I'm going to copy that text exactly, pasting it inside of our it name. Then we can go ahead and add our arrow function. And for this case, all we're going to do is create a variable called response, passing in some sort of string with just spaces. We're still going to be calling isRealString, and right here we'll pass in a bunch of spaces. And now we're going to assert that response is false. Expect response to be false, which it should be because we do not have a valid string. Next up, last test case. It should allow strings with non-space characters. I'm going to paste that in here, and then we can go ahead and actually set up the test case. You could have provided a bunch of different values as the argument to isRealString. We're still going to make that response variable. We're still going to call isRealString, but right here, I'm going to choose to pass in space, Andrew, space, which is valid. The trim function is going to remove those spaces in the validation process. And down below, we can expect that response is true, to be true. Awesome. That's all you needed to do. We can go ahead and remove the comments since we have the actual code in place. And the last thing to do is run the test case to make sure our code actually works. npm test is going to get that done. This is going to run our test suite, and right here we have our 3 test cases for isRealString. All of them are passing, which is fantastic. Now, as I mentioned, you could pretty much pass anything in here. The letter D would work as a valid room name or username. If I rerun the test suite with D as my string, the test case still passes. It doesn't really matter what you passed into here as long as it had a real non-space character. Now that we have this in place, we are done. We're not going to make a commit just yet. We're kind of halfway through a feature. We'll commit once we have a little more in place. That's coming up next, so stay tuned. I will see you then.